For more than a decade, our financial world was ruled by a really strange paradox. So today, we're going to dig into the era of so-called cheap money and ask one very important question.
For what felt like forever, right, the entire economy was working under one simple rule. Money was incredibly cheap to get your hands on. And because of that, borrowing just became normal. Whether you were thinking about a car, a house, or even starting a business, getting a loan felt surprisingly simple. Almost too easy.
The monthly payment seemed pretty low, and the whole idea of taking on debt just didn't have that same scary feeling it used to. It all felt totally manageable.
Okay, but here is the big mystery. If money was so cheap and so easy to get, why did everyday life, for so many of us, feel like it was getting more expensive? That is the paradox we're going to unpack.
So it all starts with the first and most obvious consequence of cheap money, the way it makes the price of, well, almost everything go up.
Okay, just look at these numbers. This slide shows you everything you need to know. It's the exact same $400,000 loan. At a 3% rate, your payment is around $1,700. But at 7%, it's $2,600. That huge gap in what you can afford on a monthly basis, it changes the entire game.
And this is the chain reaction that gets set off. It starts with that cheaper financing we just saw. That means more people can now afford the monthly payment, right? So suddenly you have a flood of new qualified buyers in the market. That creates a huge surge in demand for things like houses. And what happens when way more people want something than there is to go around? You guessed it, prices go through the roof for everyone.
And you got to remember, this wasn't just happening with houses. I mean, when putting your money in a savings account gets you basically nothing, all that cheap capital has to find a home somewhere. So it pours into the stock market, it pushes up real estate values everywhere, and it even fuels crazy bubbles and more speculative stuff. The price of everything you might actually want to own just keeps climbing.
But, of course, a party like that doesn't last forever. Eventually, the cycle has to turn. And that leads to a really painful turning point, where things start to feel tight. This is what's known as the squeeze.
You can really think about this whole thing in two parts. First, you have phase one. That's when low rates create this buying frenzy, and prices just shoot straight up. But then comes phase two, and this is when everything flips, rates start to rise, and now any new buyer gets hit with a nasty double whammy. They have to deal with the super high prices left over from phase one, and they have to pay the new, much higher cost to borrow money.
And that, right there, is the definition of the squeeze. It's that awful combination of being stuck with the inflated prices that cheap money created while also having to pay the new higher interest rates. You really do get the worst of both worlds.
So let's make this a little more personal. Imagine two people. Buyer A gets in when rates are low, and their monthly payment is, pretty comfortable. But buyer B comes along later and, for the exact same house, is under way more financial pressure every single month. Same asset, but a totally different level of stress.
This quote just nails the trade-off perfectly. At first, cheap money makes it seem easier to get in the game. It lowers that barrier to entry. But the hidden cost is that it makes participating in the economy more expensive for everybody else who comes along later.
All right, so let's zoom out a bit. We've talked about individuals, but this didn't just affect our personal bank accounts. It completely reshaped our entire economy, shifting it from feeling pretty safe to being, well, pretty fragile.
So who was doing all this borrowing? The short answer is everybody. Households took on more debt because the payments felt so affordable. Corporations loaded up on cheap loans to grow their business. And yeah, even governments ran up bigger deficits because, hey, the interest payments were super low.
All of this created this powerful and kind of dangerous illusion of safety. When money is that cheap, taking on debt, what the pros call leverage, it doesn't feel risky. In fact, it kind of feels like the smartest thing you can do.
But, and this is the really crucial part, that feeling of safety is just that, a feeling. The reality is that more debt, more leverage always makes the system more fragile. It just shrinks the margin for error for families, for companies, and for the whole economy.
So what happens when the party's over? When the music finally stops? Let's talk about the aftermath and the true cost of all that cheapness.
And this, right here, might be the single most important takeaway from all of this. The consequences of that cheap money era are permanent. They don't just magically disappear when interest rates finally go back up.
We're left with this hangover. The prices for things like houses are still high. That mountain of debt that everyone took on, it's still there.
And the system as a whole just has less of a safety net, less ability to handle the next crisis that comes along.
So when you really boil it all down, it's pretty simple. The whole point of low interest rates was to create some comfort, to make things feel easier in the here and now.
But that comfort came with a hefty price tag. We were basically borrowing relief from the future to make the present feel better. And in doing so, we just cranked up the financial pressure on ourselves down the road.
Which leaves us with one last question to think about. When you look at all the financial stress people are feeling right now, you have to wonder, is it just an echo? Did all that comfort we enjoyed yesterday directly create the pressure that so many of us are feeling today?